Hello and welcome to BloombergQuint. The country and the global economy is technically in an unlock phase, but the virus continues to spread, and as a result, business economic activity on the ground remains far from normal. Where are we in terms of the economic repair and resuscitation process, but also what's happening in the markets, which seems fairly disconnected from what's happening in the economy? Joining us to talk about that and a lot more, by no means just that, is Dr. Anantha Nageswaran. He's part-time member at the PMEAC, of course, has worn many hats over the years and a long-time watcher of the Indian markets and economy. Dr. Nageswaran, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I am going to start, sir, with requesting you to put on your previous hat together with your current hat, because there's been much debate about what's happening in markets globally, but also locally. While there seems to be no sense of normalization of economic activity, markets seem like they're in a much better place. What, to your mind, explains this disconnect? Is it a disconnect?
Oh, I must tell you, Ira, that I'm completely lost. Of course, I mean, just to be very clear, I'm speaking here in my personal capacity and not as a member of the EAC or for Government of India. It's purely my personal views. But having said that, coming back to your question, I am clueless. I mean, this morning I just saw a tweet by David Rosenberg that some few stocks in S&P 500 constitute the market cap of the entire topics index in Japan. So, I mean, and if you look at the surveys by Ipsos Mori's and others, people are now saying that their employment is their biggest worry. So I think the pandemic, so far at least, far from tilting the balance between capital and labor more towards labor, has once again stacked the deck against them. And I think companies, in the name of saving cost and adjusting to the new normal, are resorting to the old playbook of trying to load the entire cost of the COVID impact on the labor force. And therefore, if you see articles about European recovery, US recovery, etc., the point about employment generation is that it is lagging, or jobs are still being furloughed, or people are being laid off, etc. So clearly, I think the market is benefiting from the enormous amount of liquidity and the short-term good news coming from the vaccine development, or from the point of view of companies beating some estimates. Estimates have been really brought down such low levels, but the market doesn't correct when the estimates are brought down, but they go up when the estimates are beaten. So we are clearly in probably the most extreme disconnect, that even more than what we saw in the year 2000 or in 2008. But to make sense of it is an impossible task, Ira.
Dr. Nageswaran, now globally, of course, we have seen this for a while since the global financial crisis, the central bank influence in markets. Do you see the same or something similar playing out in India? Now, our central bank has not been that aggressive in terms of purchasing assets, etc. But as Neelkanth Mishra has been pointing out, what he calls excess M3 growth is perhaps the highest in over a decade or so. Is that flowing into asset inflation in the economy?
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen Neelkanth make that point, and also Dr. Pranab Sen made that point in one of his recent articles as well. So when the economic activity is relatively muted, and it sort of keeps going in and out depending on the lockdown lifting and being reimposed, etc. So the bulk of the flows does indeed go towards speculative activities. In fact, in Bloomberg itself, I saw some stories about Indian retail investors being drawn to the US tech market ascent, etc. So clearly, I think when you talk of excess money supply growth, this is basically money supply growth minus economic growth, and if that is on the higher side, it does spill over into the stock markets and speculative activity in general. So to some extent, it does hold good for the Indian market situation as well.
It's a tough situation or a tough choice for the central bank, though, right? Given the kind of dislocation that was there a few months back, there was justification to keeping liquidity easy and, of course, cutting interest rates. Has that shifted at all to your mind, or does the central bank needs to be a little bit more sort of, I think in an earlier conversation you said they have to be nimble. Is it that point where they need to start adjusting now?
So I think the answer would be depending on the context. In the American context, for example, they really literally threw the kitchen sink at the problem. And I think one could say the same thing about many other advanced countries, central banks, and they have, as usual, overreacted, all being done in the name of jobs and output preservation or relief or recovery, but disregarding past evidence that they all flow towards speculative activity. But I think in the Indian context, what we can say is that to the extent that some of these government central bank measures are directed towards reviving economic activity, because we are not a developed country and we do have enormous amount of idle capacity and underutilization and short-term demand deficiency, etc. So I don't think the answer is that we need to sort of go back towards withdrawing some of the accommodation in the Indian context, but in fact trying to make sure that the accommodation is provided in the right areas that leads to relief in economic activity, to revival of economic activity. So I think the answer has to be different depending on the advanced and developing country context.
Okay. Since we're in this thread of conversation, an interesting article from you in the Mint newspaper. You seems to have converted onto the monetization side of the debate. I'm not sure if you were always on that side, but your article does make a case for it.
I was actually, to be honest with you, I was sort of sitting on the fence. Let me concede that I was not opposed to it, because as facts keep emerging, you do need to adjust your priors as well. And I was sitting on the fence because I know that from the Indian context and also globally too, sometimes when you start off on a path, it may be difficult to pull back. So in that sense, I was always worried about the side effects and the consequences, with the 2011-13 episode being fresh in our minds about overheating, etc. But again, as you kind of see people downgrading their growth estimates for India, and with states going back into lockdowns, etc. So I think the cost benefit ratio of acting versus not acting, they keep shifting. So in that sense, I felt that if we could keep the lessons of 2011-13 in mind clearly, and I think markets also will definitely put a dampener on developing countries going the full Monty on deficit monetization. So keeping all those things in mind, I felt on balance I should advocate this rather than shy away from advocating it.
Okay, so first your view and then some counter views. So
Yeah.
your view is that one takes a calibrated approach, obviously, but in the sense that you say X amount is the government spending needed, and out of that, X amount needs to come via regular means, but the central bank can monetize this. This should be a 1 year, 2 year exercise within a new sort of, independent fiscal council. Is that the kind of structure that you are advocating?
No, I think I didn't apply my mind towards the independent fiscal council issue, etc. When those are in the realm of what we call structural reforms in terms of improving the quality of institutions, etc. I'm clearly they are welcome, regardless of whether we do deficit monetization or not, because I think we do need to re-establish fiscal policy credibility for the medium to long term. So that I completely welcome, but I wasn't thinking about it. What I had in mind was a somewhat limited, taking into consideration the starting point of a high fiscal deficit already that we have, both center and states combined. So I was having roughly in my mind, which the article did not articulate, and both Srini and I, who wrote this article together, I mean, I haven't even spoken to him. So my own personal sense is that we're talking about a $50 billion number, which works out to 3.75 lakh crores at current exchange rates, and that's roughly close to around 2% of GDP, if not quite there. And I think to some extent, to the extent that the multiplier effects kickstart, depending on whether the government makes payments to contractors, to state governments, etc., then I think it is. So mine was not an open-ended scheme in terms of a timeline extending up to 1 or 2 years, but what I had was a fixed sum in mind.
Okay, and the reason that you believe that this will not prove to be inflationary is because of the demand side conditions that we are existing in right now?
Absolutely. So if you go back to 2011-13 episode, which is the nearest memory point we all have, at that time, I think the market was in trough to the emerging market growth story and catch up and convergence story. And the recovery was already well underway in the developed world, no matter how unsatisfactory it was compared to the previous episodes, but there was a recovery. And I think, and it overstayed the welcome. It lasted for 3 years in India. So starting from 2010 all the way until 2013 or so. So, but therefore, I think given the fact that we are running a current account surplus, which basically shows demand has collapsed, and clearly uncertainty about jobs and uncertainty about the lockdown itself, because we still have the winter yet to come, etc. So I think the situations are not exactly similar, and I think the animal spirits in the private sector at that time were still far too high, if anything. And that, in fact, was one of the reasons why we had NPAs ballooning from 2014 onwards, because the corporate sector was still over investing at that point in time based on very optimistic assumptions about India's growth rate, etc. So I think the situations are not entirely comparable, and that is the reason why I feel this time, quote unquote, is different from the 2011-13 episode.
Okay. There was a counter view, although the quantum that was being discussed was very different. Rabobank had a report out saying that hypothetically, if India were to monetize about 10% of GDP of deficit, you could have inflation as high as 12%, a currency depreciating by almost 16 odd percent. Any thoughts on their rationale?
Well, I think you actually partially answered my question in your own remarks, Ira, which is that Rabobank's report assumes an additional fiscal stimulus package equivalent to 10% of GDP, and the entire thing being financed by central bank. So, I mean, that clearly, if that kind of magnitudes, if those are spoken about, then the consequences which they outline are not impossible. I mean, at the end of the day, of course, whether those consequences exactly play out or not, after all, it's a model. It will depend on how quickly the private sector is able to catch on to the government stimulus and sort of kickstart itself. But their estimates are plausible of the rupee depreciation of around 25% in the second year, and inflation shooting up to 12%, given the 10% number they're talking about. So I think, but what Indonesia has done is something closer to about 2.4% of GDP. And yes, of course, the rupiah has weakened by about 3 to 4% since they made the announcement, in the context of a dollar that is remaining weak. So I understand that, but that still is very tolerable. And the bond yield hasn't really picked up in Indonesia. So in other words, the important thing to watch is whether the inflation risk premium gets out of hand. And I think if we can announce a package which has built-in safeguards, I think the market would probably give it the benefit of doubt. And as always, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating.
All right. I just want to shift focus a little bit from this debate onto the real sector as well. Give us your assessment from all the conversations you have, etc., as to how much we have managed to succeed in putting a floor under the damage, particularly for the SME sector. That was the largest component or the one of the more material components of the last package. Is that likely to be needed to be upped, given that the disruption hasn't ended?
So I think the sort of whether we have put a floor under the economic activity, unfortunately, that's a moving target, simply because we are not done with the lockdowns yet. I think that's a problem, and that's what makes it difficult to say whether we have really put a floor or not. So indicators do show signs of improvement, and then they reverse themselves. But on the face of it, we're able to see that given the good situation in rural India, that we have demand for two-wheelers and tractors, and as well as some other agriculture-related equipments, steel, etc. So those are picking up, and I think also if you look at the power shortfall in terms of the consumption last year and this year, that shortfall is getting bridged. In the MSME space, yes, the government's 3 lakh crore package, one gets the sense that about half of it has been sanctioned and another 60% has been disbursed, etc. I think obviously more needs to be done there, and I think if there is enough inadequate offtake from the MSME space, I think this scheme can be extended to even larger enterprises other than only MSMEs alone. So clearly, there is still room to do more, because I don't know if you focused, Ira, on the RBI's annual annual report which they bring out. It used to be regularly done in September every year, but in 2019 it came out only in March 2019. And then for 1920, it came out only in February 2020 monthly bulletin, which is the basically RBI tracks the investment intentions of the Indian corporate sector based on fundraising disclosure that the companies file, whether it is banks, FIs, ECBs, rupee-denominated bonds, etc. Clearly, there was a nascent sign of investment revival in that data, and that the COVID has snuffed out. So I think to some extent, if the government can remove the uncertainty by showing that there is somebody who's willing to put a floor there, sometimes signaling is so important, then I think the investment revival that was beginning to happen hopefully can resume, even if it partially.
You would have to crowd in that investment though, right? In fact,
That's
just
right.
yesterday, the L&T CEO was saying that in their estimate, the central government, state government, and CPSE capex could be half of what they had assumed at the start of the year. I mean, that would be enormously damaging.
It is, and I think that's the reason why I think a deficit monetization, even if it is as modest as what I mentioned, 50 billion US dollars equivalent, would still be better than nothing. So the delta is probably not as big as someone would want it to be, but that is the problem we face because of the legacy of the fiscal deficit we are bringing to the table with us. So, but at the end of the day, it's a question of providing some delta here, no matter how big or how small the delta is. And as you correctly put it, because the investment revival did show some signs in terms of, because if you look at the investment approvals given by banks in the first half of 1920, they were significantly higher than the approvals given for project loan sanctioned in 1890. So how much of the sanctioned amount in 1920 would have actually been invested in on the ground capital outlay was something which we don't have the data yet on, but surely the COVID would have definitely dampened many of those plans, made them put them back on the shelf. So I think it's important that at least some of it is again brought out, and that would depend on the demand visibility for the private sector. And to the extent that the government can put money in the hands of people through its own deficit spending and monetization, that would at least partially restore some of this crowding in effect that you were mentioning, Ira.
Dr. Nageswaran, I'm not going to go into great detail about a public works program, etc. We discussed that recently in another conversation, which we did broadcast to our BQ viewers as well. I do want to ask you though, do you suspect that at least some amount of whatever spending happens will need to go into financial sector repair? I asked that because just yesterday, the CEA made a comment saying that what is really holding back the economy is the banking sector. And it's a little frustrating from the outside because that has been the case for 5 years now. Whether it is the money or the reforms that are required, it does seem like this financial sector repair process is dragging out far too long.
No, I think many people would share your frustration, Iran. I think unfortunately the global evidence is that financial sector repairs and financial sector induced slowdowns do take longer than normal demand efficiency slowdowns to repair themselves and to heal themselves. And you are right, it's a question of both the capital shortage, which in turn is due to the government's fiscal constraint, as well as reforms. But in spite of all of that, there is this animal spirit thing which is both absent in the real sector and in the financial sector, and that no amount of government reforms or capital top up would bring back. But having said that, the government needs to do what it needs to do, and the overhang of the bad assets in the balance sheets definitely creates a psychological dampener. And whether or not the financial sector reforms would actually be the good panacea that we are all talking about, that is definitely not something that we can guarantee, because some things may take longer. But we need to do what needs to be done, and as you correctly put it, it has been hanging fire for 5 years. So regardless of the efficacy, which nobody can guarantee, what needs to be done should be done.
Let me put you on the spot and ask you for a view on this sort of what I see as a return back into opacity for the financial sector. Moratoriums, may have been necessary for up to a point. I don't know how much utility they'll have over a longer period of time. Inaccurate or in data which is not available on the moratoriums. Talk of a once-time restructuring plan. instead of improving, are we not going back to mistakes made of the past if we do go down this route, particularly the one-time restructuring?
Well, again, I think theoretically you can say yes. The answer is yes to your question, but that way many countries around the world, including developed countries, are going back on many of the things that they told us were sacrosanct for the last 40 years, whether it is deficit spending, deficit monetization, central bank acting as purely as an agent of the fiscal authorities rather than being independent, currency depreciation, trade protectionism, going back on immigration, open borders, open economy, etc. You name it. So I think while some of them are clearly egregious and politically driven, the fact remains that economics is about the context and not about sort of permanent, immutable theories or policy decisions. So from that perspective, as long as we all know that some of these things are not the beginning of a trend back to opacity or non-transparency or evergreening of bad assets, etc., then I think one of moratoriums or standstills or restructuring, especially in those cases where the bad assets are not because of entrepreneurial failure, but because of government policy actions or inaction, whether it's in the power sector, whether it is in tariff adjustments, etc., then I think such a one-time restructuring would be legitimate.
Dr. Nageswaran, let me ask you, I've thrown a lot of very specific questions, so let me broaden out the conversation and ask you on what you think the country's attention needs to be on right now. After our last conversation, it was pointed out to me that perhaps economists are not paying enough attention to the need to first go ahead and control the disease and for health spending to ensure that the damage there is limited. Is that something that you would also advocate and, as part of the broader policy?
No, that's definitely a motherhood statement, and will be very hard to dispute its validity or usefulness. But clearly, I think the virus contagion is the virus spread is definitely slowing down in Delhi, and we will see that in the metros relatively soon, in about 1 to 2 months, and then the second and third tier cities will follow. Of course, all of us are hoping and praying that the winter doesn't lead to a massive spread of the infection again. So, but regardless, what this episode has indeed brought out is the spend on primary and secondary healthcare, which is both an economic stimulus and a long-term structural fundamental that we need to put in place. And it will serve the purpose of the virus spread as well as improving the long-term fundamentals. So in that sense, if you can create community health workers in tracking and advising people, whether it is on COVID or malaria or tuberculosis, etc. So clearly, there are two birds to be killed in one stone here. And the answer is undoubtedly yes, we need to focus on the health sector itself and the creation of infrastructure, both in terms of putting human resources and financial resources into play, is both a short-term demand management imperative as well as a structural imperative.
What else would you, have your eyes on in terms of immediate priorities, both from the monetary policy side? We have another monetary policy decision coming up, but also from the government side.
So I think as we discussed clearly, I feel that there is a need for a second round of spending, and I think it's good that the finance minister also has indicated that she is open to it. The question is one of timing, and I think there are people who argue, and Dr. Pranab mentioned in the conversation we had last week that sometimes if you wait too long, it may become completely useless as well. So that is the timing risk that they need to keep in mind. And as you pointed out, the financial sector repair has been in the work for 5 years, and we need to do what we need to do. And the third thing I would say is the SME sector. If the current liquidity scheme is not being fully utilized, it needs to be extended to medium and larger sized enterprises as well. And lastly, I would say whether it is healthcare or primary education, states do need to agree on certain things that need to be done. And I think the sooner we have consensus on some of the reforms on non-financial sector, health, education, etc., and they will act as both as short-term demand stimulus and long-term structural improvement measures.
One follow-up question. How relevant is pure and simple interest rate policy right now? I mean, I know that the RBI needed to cut upfront, perhaps from a confidence perspective, and to keep markets a little bit, sort of lubricated. But at this stage, having already front-loaded a fair amount of rate cuts, how relevant is
Yeah.
interest rate policy?
So in the very, very short term, we'll talk of next 1 to 2 months or even 1 quarter, probably it isn't particularly relevant because, as you said, RBI has front-loaded it and corporate bond spreads have come down and states have been able to borrow at much tighter spreads than before. And the government's 10-year bond yield itself is sort of hovering around 5.8%, etc. It doesn't flat up. And clearly we know that right now the offtake problem of credit is not so much one of cost, but one of uncertain demand outlook. So, in the very short run, I think the RBI can sort of work or devote its energies and resources towards making sure that all the previously announced measures are actually delivering on the ground rather than focusing on an interest rate cut in itself. It might not be necessarily urgent, but sometimes the problem is delivering an interest rate cut may not be the answer, but not delivering it may turn out to be a disappointment. So keeping the balance between the two and exercising judgment is RBI's call. So, but if you ask me, I would say probably for the next 1 to 2 months or even 1 quarter, that isn't particularly urgent.
Absolutely. I think if they were to not deliver a cut or sound even mildly hawkish, the already steep yield curve will steepen further, and that wouldn't serve any purpose. Dr. Nageshwaran, thank you. Always a pleasure to speak to you. Appreciate you
My
taking all
pleasure,
of our
Ira.
questions patiently. That's Dr. V. Anantha Nageswaran talking about markets, economy, and of course, some of the uncertainties that we continue to grapple with. Thanks for watching.